The air inside the Earth Defense Council chamber was thick with tension, a tangible weight pressing down on everyone present. Commander Jackson Morgan stood apart from the gathered officials, his scarred face impassive, arms crossed over his chest. He had faced down insurgents on Maros, survived ambushes in the asteroid belt, and lived to recount battles no one wanted to hear about. Yet, the holographic projection in the center of the room was something else entirely. A towering reptilian figure clad in ceremonial armor, its voice a guttural rumble laced with disdain. "Humans," the alien king sneered, his slit-pupil eyes gleaming. "Your defiance has lasted longer than expected, but your time is over. Surrender your world and bow to the Draconis Empire, or face annihilation." The message ended abruptly, leaving the room in silence, broken only by the faint hum of the hollow projector. Zarkash, ruler of the Draconis, was not a being to make idle threats. Reports of decimated colonies and conquered star systems followed his empire like the tail of a comet. Earth was the latest target, and resistance seemed futile. Jackson's gaze shifted to Admiral Bryce, a weathered man with gray hair and sharp eyes that never wavered, even now. "You brought me in for this?" Jackson asked, his tone as sharp as a plasma knife sheathed at his side. "A lecture from a lizard?" Bryce exhaled heavily. "It's more than a lecture. It's a declaration of war." Jackson scoffed. "They've been at war with us for years. What's changed? They're demanding our total surrender," Bryce said, his voice low. "If we don't comply, they'll burn Earth to ash. Zarkash himself will lead the campaign." Jackson's jaw tightened. He had seen the aftermath of Draconis' invasions. Cities reduced to rubble, civilians slaughtered or enslaved. He had sworn to protect Earth, but against an empire as vast as the Draconis, the odds were grim. "They're calling it their final culling," Bryce continued, glancing around the room. "But we have a plan, something desperate, but it might just work." Jackson didn't flinch. "I'm listening." Bryce nodded to a technician, who brought up a holographic map of a planet veiled in dense green swirls. "Irinder 4, the Admiral said. A remote Draconis-controlled world where Zarkash conducts a sacred hunting ritual. For a brief window, he'll be away from his fleet and his empire's core defenses. Vulnerable. The word hung in the air like an electric charge. Vulnerable. It wasn't a word often associated with Zarkash. "You want me to kill him?" Jackson said flatly. Bryce met his gaze. "Precisely. Without Zarkash, the Draconis lose their figurehead, their divine leader. It won't end the war, but it might buy us enough time to regroup." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "And how do I get to him?" "Stroll past his elite guards and ask him to lower his head." "We'll get you in close," Bryce said. "Stealth insertion via cloak transport. You'll have the element of surprise, advanced tech, and this." A small case was placed on the table before Jackson. Inside was a weapon unlike anything he had seen, a sleek, black plasma blade with faint red veins pulsing along its edge. "The Erebus blade," Bryce said. "A prototype. It's silent, deadly, and designed to cut through even Draconis' armor. But it's not just a weapon, it's a statement. Zarkash needs to know who killed him and why." Jackson studied the blade for a moment before closing the case. "Sounds like a suicide mission." "It is," Bryce admitted. "But if anyone can do it, it's you." Jackson's mind flashed to memories of his squad. Men and women he had fought beside, laughed with, and buried. The Draconis had taken them, just as they had taken countless others. He thought of Earth, its blue oceans and green forests, the people who called it home. Surrender wasn't an option. "When do I leave?" he asked. Bryce straightened. "Immediately. Your transport is prepped and waiting." The chamber emptied quickly after that, leaving Jackson alone with his thoughts. He lingered for a moment, staring at the holographic projection of Zarkash that still hovered above the table. The alien king's image flickered, his expression one of arrogance and cruelty. "You don't know me," Jackson muttered, "but you will." The transport was sleek and silent, a marvel of Earth's latest stealth technology. As it broke through Arinder Ivy's atmosphere, Jackson gazed out at the alien world below. Thick jungle stretched as far as the eye could see, their canopies glowing faintly in hues of blue and green. The planet was alive with sounds, alien birds calling, strange beasts roaring in the distance. It was beautiful in a savage, untamed way. But Jackson wasn't here to admire the scenery. As the transport hovered above a clearing, he leaped out, landing with a practice roll. The jungle enveloped him immediately, its thick foliage and humid air pressing in from all sides. He adjusted his visor, which displayed a map of the area and highlighted potential threats. Mission clock starts now, he muttered to himself, gripping the Erebus blade. Every step he took was measured, every sound scrutinized. The jungle was alive with movement, and he knew he wasn't alone. The Draconis were here, somewhere, and so was Zarkash. Jackson pressed deeper into the jungle, his senses on high alert. He had faced impossible odds before, but this mission was different. It wasn't just about survival. It was about sending a message. Earth wouldn't bow. Not to Zarkash. Not to anyone. As he moved silently through the undergrowth, a single thought kept him focused. Failure wasn't an option. If he didn't succeed, Earth was doomed. And Jackson Morgan wasn't about to let that happen. The jungle pulsed with life, a chaotic symphony of alien sounds and shifting shadows. Jackson Morgan moved through the dense undergrowth with the fluid precision of a predator, every muscle attuned to the rhythms of the alien world around him. Irinderful was unlike any battlefield he'd faced before. Its dangers weren't confined to the Draconis' soldiers patrolling its depths. Here, even the trees seemed alive, their gnarled roots coiling like serpents, the bioluminescent leaves casting an eerie glow on the forest floor. Jackson paused, crouching low as he surveyed his surroundings. His visor displayed a faint overlay of the terrain, marking a waypoint just over 2 clicks ahead, the location where Zarkash was expected to perform his ritual. Between Jackson and the target lay unknown threats, and his every move felt like walking a razor's edge. The first sign of trouble came in the form of silence. The chatter of alien birds and insectoid creatures that had filled the air moments ago abruptly ceased. Jackson froze, his hand instinctively tightening around the hilt of the Erebus blade. He scanned the area, his breathing shallow, ears straining for the faintest sound. Then he saw it, a shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. Cloaking technology. Draconis scouts. Jackson moved first. He ducked into the shadows, pressing his back against the rough bark of a massive tree. The shimmer moved closer, materializing into the silhouette of a tall, armored Draconis warrior. Its yellow eyes gleamed in the low light, scanning the forest with cold efficiency. Another shimmer followed behind it, then another. 3 scouts, Jackson calculated. Standard patrol. They were quiet, methodical, their movements barely stirring the leaves underfoot. This wasn't a random sweep. They were hunting something or someone. Jackson waited until the lead scout passed within striking distance. Then, with a flick of his wrist, the Erebus blade hummed to life, its edge glowing faintly with crimson energy. He moved like lightning, plunging the blade into the scout's midsection. The alien emitted a sharp hiss before collapsing silently. The second scout turned, its mandibles flaring in alarm. But Jackson was already on it. A quick slash to the throat, and it fell beside its comrade. The third scout raised a weapon, a sleek plasma rifle that hummed ominously as it powered up. Jackson dived, rolling under the line of fire as a bolt of searing energy tore through the air above him. He came up behind the scout, driving the blade into its back. The alien let out a guttural snarl before falling limp. Jackson stood over the bodies, his breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He wiped the blade clean on a nearby fern, its glowing sap hissing against the plasma edge. The skirmish had been quick, but it served as a reminder. The Draconis were relentless, and this jungle was their territory. Jackson knew he couldn't afford a single misstep. He pressed on, the jungle growing denser as he neared the waypoint. The canopy above blocked out most of the faint light from Arinder's twin moons, casting the forest in a dim, ghostly pallor. Jackson relied on his visor, its infrared display painting the world in stark contrast of heat and cold. Ahead, he spotted a faint glow, the flickering light of a campfire. Jackson dropped to his stomach, crawling forward until he could see the source. A group of Draconis soldiers sat around the fire, their elongated snouts silhouetted against the flames. There were 5 of them, their weapons within arm's reach. Jackson considered his options. He could take them out silently, one by one, but the risk of being discovered was high. Then his eyes caught something that made his blood boil, a crude cage at the edge of the camp. Inside were 2 human prisoners, their faces gaunt, their clothes torn and bloodstained. The sight ignited something primal in Jackson. These weren't soldiers. They were civilians, likely captured during one of the Draconis' raids. Killing Zarkash might be his mission, but leaving these people to die wasn't an option. Jackson reached into his pack, pulling out a small EMP grenade. He armed it with a twist of his wrist and rolled it into the camp. The device detonated with a muffled pulse, plunging the area into darkness and disabling the soldiers' weapons. He moved in quickly, striking the first Draconis before it could recover. The camp erupted into chaos, but Jackson was already in the thick of it. He used the Erebus blade with brutal efficiency, cutting down the disoriented soldiers one by one. The fight was over in seconds. Jackson approached the cage, his visor illuminating the terrified faces of the prisoners. A man and a woman, both too weak to stand. "I'm getting you out of here," he said, his voice low but firm. The man's voice trembled as he spoke. "You're human? I thought we were the only ones left alive." "Not for long," Jackson said, slicing through the cage's lock. "Can you walk?" The woman shook her head. "They broke his leg," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Jackson didn't hesitate. He hoisted the man over his shoulder, motioning for the woman to follow. "Stay close and keep quiet," he instructed. The escape was harrowing. Jackson led the prisoners through the jungle, avoiding patrols and using every ounce of his training to keep them hidden. The man groaned softly with each step, but Jackson pressed on, determined to get them to safety. Finally, they reached a small cave, its entrance obscured by hanging vines. Jackson set the man down gently and turned to the woman. "Stay here," he said. "I'll come back for you once the mission's done." "You're going after Zarkash, aren't you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jackson nodded. "Kill him," the man rasped, his eyes burning with hatred. "For all of us." Jackson didn't respond. He turned and disappeared into the jungle, his mind focused on the task ahead. The waypoint was close now, the air growing colder as he neared the sacred hunting grounds. He could see faint structures in the distance, ancient ruins covered in moss and glowing fungus. This was it. Zarkash was here. Jackson moved with deliberate care, his body coiled like a spring ready to strike. The hunt had begun, and he was ready. The ruins loomed ahead, their jagged stone spires clawing at the sky. Bathed in the sickly green glow of bioluminescent moss, the sight exuded an ancient, oppressive energy. Jackson Morgan crouched behind a cluster of dense undergrowth, his visor scanning the area. Draconis sentries were stationed at key points along the perimeter, their elongated forms casting menacing silhouettes in the dim light. Zarkash was here. Jackson could feel it. The air itself seemed to hum with tension, the faint crackle of ceremonial torches punctuated by guttural alien chants. The king's presence was undeniable, a heavy weight pressing down on the jungle. Jackson activated the thermal overlay on his visor, the world shifting into stark contrasts of heat and cold. Among the ruins, a larger, more vivid heat signature stood out, a figure far larger than the others, clad in ornate armor that radiated power. Zarkash was seated on an elevated stone platform, flanked by 2 massive Draconis bodyguards wielding ceremonial halberds. Jackson's lips pressed into a grim line. Taking out the king wouldn't be easy. The guards were formidable, and the ruins offered little cover. He would have to create his own opening. He reached into his pack, pulling out a pair of small, spherical devices. EMP charges. With practiced precision, he set the timers and lobbed them toward the ruins. The devices landed silently, embedding themselves into the mossy stone. The explosion wasn't loud, but the effect was immediate. A pulse of energy swept through the ruins, extinguishing the torches and plunging the area into darkness. The sentries reacted instantly, hissing commands and scanning the shadows for intruders. Jackson moved. He slipped through the chaos like a phantom, his Erebus blade glowing faintly in the darkness. The first sentry he encountered didn't even have time to cry out. A swift, silent strike, and it crumpled to the ground. The second sentry turned, its yellow eyes narrowing as it raised a plasma rifle. Jackson closed the distance in an instant, driving the blade into its chest. The alien let out a strangled hiss before falling limp. The commotion drew attention. A group of Draconis soldiers converged on his position, their weapons sweeping the area. Jackson darted into the shadows, his every movement calculated and precise. He was a predator, and they were his prey. The first soldier stepped into his line of sight, and Jackson struck with ruthless efficiency. The others reacted, their plasma rifles lighting up the darkness with searing bolts of energy. Jackson ducked and weaved, using the terrain to his advantage. He rolled behind a fallen pillar, his mind racing as he calculated his next move. He activated a smoke grenade, the thick cloud obscuring him from view. The Draconis hesitated, their movements uncertain. Jackson used the momentary confusion to strike, his blade flashing in the dim light. One by one, the soldiers fell, their lifeless bodies slumping to the ground. The skirmish was brutal and quick, but it served its purpose. The guards at the perimeter were either dead or scattered, leaving a clear path to Zarkash. Jackson turned his attention to the elevated platform. The Draconis' king had risen, his towering form silhouetted against the faint glow of the moss-covered ruins. Zarkash's bodyguards flanked him, their halberds gleaming ominously in the dim light. The king's voice boomed through the ruins, a guttural snarl that resonated with authority. "Show yourself, human. You come to our sacred ground to die." Jackson stepped into the open, his blade held low but ready. "I didn't come here to die," he said, his voice cold and steady. "I came for you." Zarkash tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "Arrogant," he hissed. "Do you believe you can challenge me, a god among mortals?" "I don't care what you think you are," Jackson said, his tone sharp as the blade in his hand. "You're just another tyrant who needs to be put down." The bodyguards moved first, their halberds slicing through the air with terrifying speed. Jackson dodged, his movements precise and controlled. He struck out with the Erebus blade, its plasma edge cutting through one guard's weapon like it was nothing. The alien roared in fury, swinging wildly as Jackson sidestepped and drove the blade into its chest. The second guard was faster, its halberd arcing toward Jackson with deadly intent. He ducked, the weapon grazing his shoulder and sending a jolt of pain through his body. Gritting his teeth, he countered with a vicious slash, severing the guard's arm. The alien staggered back, hissing in agony, before Jackson finished it with a clean strike to the neck. Zarkash watched impassively as his guards fell, his expression unreadable. When the second body hit the ground, he stepped forward, drawing a massive blade that glowed with an ominous red light. "You have courage, human," Zarkash said, his voice almost admiring. "But courage will not save you." Jackson didn't respond. He lunged, his blade aimed for the Draconis' king's chest. Zarkash met the strike with his own blade, the clash of plasma weapons sending a shockwave through the ruins. The force of the impact nearly knocked Jackson off balance, but he recovered quickly, pressing the attack. The duel was ferocious. Zarkash was far stronger than any opponent Jackson had faced, his movements deceptively fast for his size. The king's blade whirled through the air, each strike carrying lethal precision. Jackson relied on his agility, dodging and countering with swift, calculated blows. The fight pushed him to his limits. Every muscle burned. Every breath was a struggle. Zarkash's strikes grew more aggressive, each one narrowly missing its mark. Jackson could feel his strength waning, but he refused to back down. Finally, he saw an opening. Zarkash's blade came down in a heavy arc, and Jackson sidestepped, driving the Erebus blade into the king's exposed flank. The Dracones roared in pain, staggering back as blood spilled from the wound. Jackson pressed the advantage, his strikes relentless. He aimed for the weak points in Zarkash's armor, each blow chipping away at the king's defenses. The final strike came swift and merciless. Jackson drove the blade into Zarkash's chest, the plasma edge cutting through armor and flesh. The Dracones king let out a guttural snarl, his eyes burning with fury and defiance. "You think this will end us?" Zarkash rasped, blood bubbling from his lips. "We are eternal." Jackson pulled the blade free, his expression cold. "Not you." The king fell, his massive form collapsing onto the stone platform. The ruins grew silent, the weight of the moment settling over the battlefield. Jackson stood over the body, his chest heaving. The mission wasn't over yet. There was still the matter of getting out alive. But for the first time, he allowed himself a moment to breathe. Zarkash was dead. The Empire's god had fallen, and the hunt was over. The jungle was eerily quiet as Jackson Morgan descended from the ruins. Zarkash's lifeless form lay behind him, an imposing shadow finally extinguished. The faint hum of the Erebus blade in his hand felt heavier now, its energy flickering as if spent from the battle. Every step back toward the extraction point carried the weight of what he had done, and what it would mean. The mission wasn't over, not yet. Jackson's visor flickered with alerts as he moved through the dense undergrowth. Dracones forces were mobilizing, their patrols converging on the area. Killing Zarkash had sent a shockwave through their ranks, and the chaos would only escalate. The jungle, already hostile, was now a battlefield in waiting. The extraction point was less than 2 clicks away, but Jackson's body felt like lead. Every muscle screamed in protest, his injuries from the duel aching with each movement. He pressed on, his focus unshaken. Failure wasn't an option, not after everything. As he neared the cave where he had left the 2 prisoners, Jackson slowed, scanning the area for signs of movement. The jungle's shadows seemed alive, the faint rustle of leaves setting his nerves on edge. He tightened his grip on the blade and stepped forward. "Commander Morgan?" The voice was soft, trembling. The woman emerged cautiously from the cave, her face pale but her eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. Behind her, the man he had carried earlier leaned against the cave wall, his expression grim but alive. "We're leaving," Jackson said, his tone firm. "The Dracones are closing in." The woman nodded, helping the injured man to his feet. Jackson moved ahead, his visor marking a safe route through the jungle. The terrain was treacherous, but they moved as quickly as they could, the urgency of escape driving them forward. The sound of distant roars echoed through the trees, growing louder with each passing moment. The Dracones were hunting them now, and they weren't far behind. Jackson clenched his jaw, his mind racing. They needed to reach the extraction point before the enemy closed the gap. The first attack came suddenly. A plasma bolt seared past Jackson's shoulder, striking a tree and igniting its sap in a burst of flame. He spun around, spotting a group of Dracones, soldiers emerging from the foliage. Their yellow eyes gleamed with predatory hunger as they raised their weapons. "Run!" Jackson barked, stepping between the soldiers and the prisoners. He activated the Erebus blade, its crimson glow cutting through the dim jungle light. The Dracones charged, their guttural cries echoing through the trees. Jackson met them head-on, his blade moving with lethal precision. The first soldier fell with a clean strike to the chest, its weapon clattering to the ground. The second swung a massive claw, But Jackson ducked, countering with a swift slash that severed its arm. Behind him, the woman helped the injured man forward, her breaths coming in panicked gasps. Jackson fought to hold the line, every movement a desperate bid to buy them time. Another soldier lunged at him, its plasma rifle firing wildly. Jackson deflected the shots with the blade, closing the distance and driving the weapon into its throat. The alien collapsed with a wet gurgle, but more were coming. The battle blurred into a haze of movement and blood. Jackson fought like a man possessed, his body moving on instinct alone. The jungle seemed to close in around him, the shadows teeming with enemies. Finally, a distant hum cut through the chaos, the sound of the extraction transport's engines. Relief surged through Jackson as the ship descended, its cloaked form becoming visible as it hovered just above the tree line. "Go!" he shouted, motioning for the prisoners to board. The woman dragged the man up the transport's ramp, her face streaked with tears. Jackson held his ground, fending off the last of the Draconis' soldiers as the ramp began to close. One of them, larger than the rest, lunged at him with a vicious roar. Jackson sidestepped, using the alien's momentum to drive it into a tree. With a final slash, he ended the fight. He turned and sprinted for the ramp, leaping aboard just as the transport lifted off. The jungle below faded into the distance, the glowing ruins of Zarkash's sacred site disappearing into the darkness. Inside the transport, Jackson collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving. The woman knelt beside the injured man, her hands trembling as she checked his wounds. For a moment, the only sound was the low hum of the ship's engines. "You did it," the man said weakly, his eyes meeting Jackson's. "You killed him." Jackson didn't respond immediately. He stared out the viewport, watching the jungle recede into the night. Zarkash was dead, but the weight of his actions lingered. Killing the Draconis' king was a victory, but it wasn't the end. Back on Earth, the news of Zarkash's death spread like wildfire. The Draconis' empire, once an unstoppable force, was thrown into disarray. Without their divine leader, their ranks faltered, their unity fractured. But Jackson knew the war was far from over. Zarkash's death was a blow, not a finish. The Draconis would retaliate, their fury burning hotter than ever. As the transport neared Earth's orbit, Jackson rose to his feet, his resolve hardening. He had bought humanity time to regroup, to fight back. The war was still raging, but for the first time, there was hope. He glanced at the Erebus blade, its once brilliant glow now dimmed. The weapon had served its purpose, but its journey wasn't over. Neither was his. Jackson Morgan was a soldier, forged in fire and tempered by loss. And as long as humanity stood, so would he. The transport entered Earth's atmosphere, the faint tremors of re-entry vibrating through its hull. Below, the planet stretched out in vast, sprawling landscapes, scarred but enduring. The sight filled Jackson with a strange mix of relief and dread. Humanity had endured countless trials, but the shadow of the Draconis' empire still loomed. The woman approached him hesitantly, her expression a mixture of gratitude and worry. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jackson leaned against the cold metal wall, his gaze distant. "Now we prepare. They'll come for us harder than before. Zarkash's death won't stop them. It'll fuel their rage. But it gives us a chance, doesn't it?" she pressed. "A chance to fight back?" He met her eyes, the faintest flicker of a grim smile, tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, a chance. That's more than we had yesterday." The man, still weak but alert, spoke up from his seat. "You've given us hope, Commander. That's worth something." Jackson didn't respond immediately. Hope. It was a fragile thing, easily shattered but impossible to extinguish. He thought of the faces he had seen, the survivors, the fallen, the countless lives that depended on the decisions made in moments like this. As the transport neared its destination, a sprawling military base came into view. Soldiers and civilians bustled about, their movements purposeful but tense. The war had reached every corner of their existence, but they hadn't given up. Jackson stood, the weight of the mission still pressing on him. As the ramp lowered, he stepped into the cool night air. Around him, heads turned, whispers spreading. He didn't stop to listen. There was no time for celebration, not yet. The fight wasn't over, and he wasn't done. "Let's get to work," he said, his voice steady, as the base's commander approached. "We've got a war to win."